Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 56. Well, the contest has one more week to the deadline, the MyLife Chassidus Applied contest, essay contest, and I encourage you to use this week to submit your entry with the possibility of winning the first prize of a $10,000 prize, second prize $3,600, third prize $500 gift certificate. And you can submit your essays and read all the guidelines at meaningfullife.com/mylife/contest. All the details are there. And to reiterate again, this is open to everyone except of the few people who are relatives to our organization or to the judges. It's open to everyone, men, women, as the guidelines spell out. And the goal is to apply Chassidus to any given issue, topic, subject. It does not have to be your personal issue. Something where Chassidus addresses a contemporary issue, challenge, and in a way that can be explained to every person on this earth. So the best way to test whether your essay is good is by giving it actually to people who may not have knowledge of the actual original Maimorim of Chassidus and saying, what do you think about this piece? If someone says, wow, this is a great insight, this is a great tool, great tools that I can use for whatever given issue or challenge I have to deal with, you know you're on the right track. The deadline will be Rosh Chodesh Adar, which is this coming Thursday night, midnight Eastern Standard Time. As I said, all the details are at meaningfullife.com/mylife/contest. And I'm excited and intrigued to see the submissions. Many have come in already, and many more I'm sure will be coming in. And please share this with your friends. It's an exercise. It may be seemingly a little intimidating, but you know something? If you swallow the bullet, so to speak, and take the bull by the horns, I guarantee you may do a lot better than you expect. Have confidence and be focused. This is not about a long essay. The suggested length is 800 to 1,500 words. It could be longer. You should try not to make it too long. However, everything will be looked at. And again, applying Chassidus to any given issue, which is what we've been doing here for now over a year. Baruch Hashem, and hopefully continue with the questions and your participation in the questions that have been submitted. And I will continue to discuss the sensitive topic that we began last week. And thank God that I was only able to cover a little of it, because maybe these type of topics is best also as they are stretched out and over several episodes, as opposed to just focusing it in one place because of its intensity. And that's the issue of sexual molestation. Before we get to that, I want to begin, as I've done in the past few months, with the Chassidus Applied to the time that we are in right now. This month will be Rosh Chodesh Adar, as mentioned. We'll also be reading the Parsha of Terumah. So let me share a thought from Chassidus on both these things, on both Adar and Terumah. We'll start with Terumah. Now, the shortest mission statement ever stated anywhere in the Torah is the two words in this week's Parsha. V'asu li migdash, you shall create for me a migdash. And what's the mission? V'shachanti b'seichem, and I will rest among you. In two words, the entire purpose of existence, the entire purpose of each of our lives is articulated. I would challenge anyone to find a shorter way of communicating it. And how much lies in this two words, V'shachanti b'seichem? I will rest among you. In the language that many of us are familiar from Chassidus, that the Alter Rebbe brings in Perek Lamed Vav and Tanya, from Medrash Tanchuma and other Midrashim, also about the Mishkan, that Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu, God desired Liyas Loi, and as the Rebbe Rashab would often add, Yizbarach Dira B'Tachtenim. God desired to have a home in this world. Dira B'Tachtenim is a different way of saying V'shachanti b'seichem. Doesn't have the word Dira, but it's talking about a Mishkan, a Dira that God should rest among us. And as the Shalah explains, and as quoted and cited in Chassidus, why does it say b'seichem? The verse, Asu li migdash, should have said V'shachanti b'seichai. Build for me a temple. How would you translate it into English? How would you continue in English? I shall rest in it. What them is referring to a group, people, a multitude. Migdash is only within each individual. So in the time when the Beis HaMikdash stood or the Mishkan stood physically, we had that model. But even then the intention was that it should also be channeled within us. Shabbos Parshat Terumah Tovshin Mem Zayin, which goes back now, we're going back almost 28 years ago. The Rebbe spoke a beautiful sikha and spoke then about establishing Botei Chabad. Every home should be a Beis Chabad. Every home should be a Mishkan. And he brought there from the Maimorim and Vasili Migdash an interesting Chiddush, as the Rebbe emphasized then. And what's that Chiddush? That Vasili Migdash Chanti B'Seichem is said even before the Golas began. You know, you could say once the temple was destroyed, there's no other way to interpret V'Shachanti B'Seichem, because today there's no physical temple. The truth is, every Beis HaKnesses, every Beis HaMedrash, every synagogue is a Migdash Ma'at, is a mini sanctuary. But you could understand that the Mishkan is now Da'al Damash al Halacha, the individual human being, their home. But during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, you could argue the main thing was in the structure, and through the structure was a model. So he says there, brings from the Maimorim and Tavshin Daled, and some of the other Maimorim cited there, that he says that Adar, the Chiddush of the Beis HaMikdash, was always meant to be B'tzeich Kol, and everyone. And today, it's much more revealed in that sense because there's no physical building that you can, so to speak, say, the God's in the building, not inside of me. But the goal is that each of us should become a walking ambassador of what it means to live a divine life, that your arms and legs, your eyes and ears, your entire being is a channel for elokus in this world. That when someone looks at you and says, this is what God wants of a human being. So that's ultimately the essence of what the Mishkan is. And all the details of the Mishkan are ways. That's why the Mishkan was built as in a fascinating way. The Rabbeinu Bechai, the Shalah, and others. There's a great Rishima, a long Rishima from the Rebbe about this, the Rishima of Meneda and other places, where it explains that the Mishkan was actually built as a model and a parallel, mirrors the human being. In the Mishkan you had 3 sections, as in the Beis HaMikdash. You had Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies. What was there? The Holy of Holies was the Aron, the mind. So that's the head. Reish, Guf, Regel. Or sometimes Moyach, Lev, Kavod, Rosh Tevis, Melech. So the 3 parts of a human being, the head, which is the central nervous system, is the Holy of Holies. Kodesh, with 3 vessels. To the right and to the left and to the center was the Menorah, which illuminates. You have the Shulchan, which feeds and sustains. And you have the Mizbeach, the inner Mizbeach, the Mizbeach HaKteris, Mizbeach HaPnimi in the middle. So the Mizbeach is the heart. The Menorah is to the left, Eish, fire, Gvura. And the Shulchan, which is food, Lechem Aponim, is Chesed. So then you have the torso, the body of the human being, right, left, and center. And then comes the outside section, El Moed, Azora, or the larger section of outside, depending whether it's called the Beis HaMikdash or it's in the Mishkan, and there you have the Mizbeach HaChitzon, which was the Mizbeach HaKarbon, or the Mikem Kiyarkiv, as the Alter Rebbe emphasizes, Karban LaHashem, that we elevate the word Karban from the word Kiruv, to elevate and transform and integrate, refine the material world and the animal soul into the divine. So there you have the general picture. But then all the details all reflect. The Teira Se'ela is a sefer from the Ramah where he goes into detail, the entire sefer detail of how every aspect of the Mishkan, the Beis HaMikdash, and the Holy Temple is mirrored and reflected inside each of us. Because the goal is V'shachanti b'seicham, even when the Beis HaMikdash stood. And sadly, when there was sinas chinam, and Jews did not have V'shachanti b'seicham, so even b'seichai didn't work. As soon as there was a compromise that God cannot rest among you because you hate each other and Rahman al-Islam with baseless hatred, so where's there's room for God to rest in a building? The whole building is just meant to be a reflection and a channel, a conduit for the divine to rest among us. If the us is not there, the temple cannot stand. And that's why it was destroyed. Then avas chinam, through baseless and an unconditional love for one another, we repair that. And we can rebuild, firstly, among ourselves, that we are at peace with God, then we're at peace with each other, and that spills over, that ultimately will lead to the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi, that God can be at peace with the world, and have a resting place, a dwelling place, a dira, right here, V'shachanti b'seicham. So just all of this underscores the responsibility that each of us has. Each of us is a potential walking Mishkan, the goal of Parshat Terumah. Now, also entering the month of Adar, so of course, Ivdus Hashem b'simcha, that joy is not just an accessory to serving God. It itself is a mitzvah to joy. And we see human beings psychologically, when you have joy, when you're upbeat, when generally all your life is more pleasant, people want to be around you, and everything you undertake, even things that may be challenges and difficulties, when it's done with joy, when it's done with a positive attitude, is done more successfully. So this work of Shachanti B'Seicham is obviously, in the month of Adar, is enhanced by that type of attitude. And it's interesting, the month of Adar is also the Rosh Tevis Aleph Dar, the Rebbe brings from Eira Teira, in Parshat Terumah as well, that Aleph Dar means that Aleph, the Eibishter, is Dar, the Mishkan. He's Dar, like a Dira here below. Why Adar? Because Adar is the month of Simcha. Simcha, when a person is sad, and a person is despondent or depressed, they cannot be a full keli, a full container for godliness. The Eibishter rests with his joy. When there's no simcha, it's like, who wants to come into a home or into a person when they're depressed or downtrodden or feeling down? So to make Adar, Aleph Dar, that the Eibishter rests, that we should have a divine dimension that manifests within us, we have to be a keli for it. So just like arrogance, God says, Anivu hu lo yichel l'adar b'kfifa achas. God says, I cannot rest together with someone who's arrogant because there's no room for two. Simcha is a sign that you're creating that type of container, like Bittul, where the divine can rest within you. Shchanti b'seicham. Now, of course, the big question is, what happens if I'm in a bad mood? How could I bring joy? The answer always is, joy is what helps you get out of a bad mood. If you can focus on and elicit the inner essence of joy within us, which is so much part of what Chassidic psychology teaches, that you have a divine soul, even though there are many things that you could look at yourself in a very negative way, there's always something positive to look with the right eye, that you have a divine soul. No matter what challenge you have the strength to overcome it. And when you focus on that type of positive attitude, that attitude alone, an Adar Dika, Simcha Dika attitude, helps us overcome challenges. When a person, like he says in Tanya, when a person feels weak, that alone doesn't allow you to fight the battle. Because a weak person, psychologically and emotionally and physically, is weakened by their own state, and that doesn't allow you to really fight any battle that comes your way. So hopefully this the Chassidus Applied, MyLife Chassidus Applied, and with your contributions as well in this essay contest and every other possible way, together when we can take Chassidus and apply it and help empower and ignite our souls with passion to fulfill what our calling is, our V'shchanti b'seichem, each in our own way, that alone is something that can create a positive and forward-thinking approach, which is, of course, part and parcel of what joy is all about, simcha is all about. With that, let us go into a little sadder and more difficult topic, and that's the topic that I began addressing, the issue of healing from molestation and dealing with violators. So I read a number of questions last week. I began discussing the issue. I want to break it into a few parts and go a little further into it and hopefully address more comprehensively than I did in the last week's episode, 55. So I think there's a few ways to break it down. Let's begin with this. The first thing is to address the actual issue itself and the pain and the damage that it causes to people who have been violated, and the sensitivity necessary to address it and address it in an effective way. Obviously with the goal of, and that too can be broken into two parts. One, healing, if God forbid something like this has happened, and two, preventive medicine. How do we prevent? And the responsibility of the community, the family, the home, if every one of us in helping prevent, which of course is the best solution of all if we can just eradicate it in the first place. But we have to deal with the realities also on the ground. And so let's break that. That's dealing it from the perspective of the one who was violated. I don't like to use the word victim. It's very negative sounding, even survivor. Let's just use it, the person that this was perpetrated upon. And what does Chassidus have to say? What does the Rebbe have to say? What does Torah have to say about that? That's one part. Then there's going to be dealing with the predators themselves. What is our obligation? And the questions in there was the areas, can you embarrass them? Can you publicize them? What can we do to help them heal? What can we do to prevent future predators? So it's two different aspects to this entire issue. I'm going to start obviously from the first and move that way, but I want to do it in a structured fashion. And this sums up many of the questions that came in, these different structures that I just said, and as well as some of the other questions that we received in this past week, which included some of the events that are happening now. There's an investigation going on in Melbourne, Australia, which is very painful to see, the Chil Hashem and so on. But at the same time, being that it's out there already, might as well deal with it in the most healthy possible way. And so that's also part of some of the questions that came in of how could people do any cover-ups, what should be our attitude, what should be our attitude going into the future, which really spills over to all schools and summer camps and anywhere where children gather and where children are, and their authorities responsible for them. What is our responsibilities? What are the responsibility of these institutions? So yes, everybody knows that many people would have been more comfortable had this never been brought up, but that doesn't mean necessarily that was healthier. If it indeed is going on, if it's not going on, obviously it's better than it's not brought up because nothing's happening. But if something is happening, it indeed is much better to deal with it in a healthy way instead of just ignoring and denying when people are being murdered spiritually and emotionally through this. So now the fact is, now it's there. So one of the questions that I want to address, which is I began the last episode talking about, firstly, that we must know thy enemy. If indeed somebody, for example, when you're 5 years old or 10 years old or 15 years old, goes over and gives you a slap on your face, so obviously to go make a whole federal investigation about that, you could say, you know what, get over it. This is what happens. Just like, people make mistakes. I'm not saying someone's entitled to slap you. Or just like other things we deal with, we have a certain resilience. Human spirit has resilience. And you grow through different challenges. I'm just using a very superficial one. Then there are other events in life. For example, God forbid, children lose family members, parents, and so on. These are God-sent tragedies. And there too, healthy people learn how to grow through it. We don't understand why. And unhealthy people sometimes get hurt by it. However, we're dealing with something that is more than just, this is not a God event. And neither is it a minor event. And I think this is important. You must identify the issue. I'll just use an example. The Rebbe rarely got involved in piskei halachas, in legal rulings. And he made it clear. This is the domain of Rabbonim, and you go to Rabbonim for this. But there were times the Rebbe made an exception, and he explained why he made an exception. When he saw that he had particular knowledge, the Rebbe that is, about a particular issue, so he felt that he had something that other rabbis simply did not know the facts. There's a story in the Gemara, Rab Chia and others who would go study years with shepherds to learn about different animals, because you cannot paskin halacha about animals if you don't know what an animal is like. It's not a theoretical thing. So besides having knowledge, you have to also know the facts. If someone never saw a behemoth, he could learn Hilchos Kashrus, he could learn Hilchos Treifus, all the laws in halacha and Gemara and so on, and be a master of it. But if you never saw a behemoth, never saw a shchita, you never saw the inside of a behemoth, he's missing a major component, which is why we need shimush, we need actual experience, we need what they call residency or apprenticeship, or whatever you want to call it. So the same thing is here. The two exceptions that come to mind, there were more than two, but there were two main ones where the Rebbe came out about radio. The question was about the use of radio for, let's say, Shabbat, to hear the davening or to hear Shofar and so on, other things, or Megillah on the radio. So there were those that ruled when radio first became an option in the middle of the 20th century, or the early 20th century, or the late of the 19th century. Some suggested that radio is like a pipe. And they ruled based on that. The Rebbe, due to his knowledge, wherever he got it from, was that radio is not a pipe. Radio is transforming sounds into electrical impulses, transmitting that over long distances or short distances. So it's not Kel Adam, which is the big issue. So when it comes to learning Teda, you can learn, which is not, you don't need to hear the voice of a person, you have to hear the ideas. Radio would be fine. Same thing with television. Same thing with the telephone. But if indeed you need Kel Adam, where Kel Shofar, for example, you need the sound of an actual Shofar being blown, and even Shofar being blown by an echo, in a pit, is not acceptable, or Megillah, or other things where it's not the content that needs to be transmitted, but you need actual Kel Adam, if indeed it's electrical impulses. So there they ruled, their ruling was fine, but it was based on a faulty understanding of the technology. The second issue was regarding the ships riding on Shabbos. The Rebbe was a ship engineer and had certain knowledge of how ships function, so he got involved because he simply had intimate information about the technology of ships. And there's some other exceptions. I want to apply it here as well. To rule on the issue of the effects of child molestation and so on, you have to have mumchim and experts who know what the effects are. Someone will say, you know what, I don't think it has so much damage. Based on what are you saying that? You can be a great Rav, but you just don't have that information. It would be like a Rav ruling and saying a certain illness is not pekuach nefesh. That's not correct. A Rav can't rule that. A Rav has to say, let's hear what a doctor says. The doctor says it's life-threatening, or even a doubtful life-threatening. Then my ruling is, we follow that. Pekuach nefesh is deicha Shabbos, is deicha kol hateidah kula for that matter. Yom Kippur as well. So you need to have the joint partnership of the doctor, not as a legal ruling, but the doctor to give you the facts, and then the rabbi can rule. The issue of this entire painful issue, number one, which is obviously hopefully being corrected as we speak, was that for many years it was not understood, it was not diagnosed, so to speak. And therefore, technically you could say, and I'm saying those that even had good intentions, I'm not getting to people that have bad intentions, and had intentional cover-up, or they were themselves culpable or guilty, etc. Let's talk about a naivete or a lack of knowledge. If you don't know the damage that it does, so obviously your ruling is, listen, things happen to people. The person who perpetrated has to be dealt with, but the severity and understanding of what kind of impact it has, not just on the child, but as the child grows up and becomes an adult, on marriage, on their mind, on sexuality, on generational effects, today we're far more aware of that. And as such, a Rav can say, I was not aware of that type of damage. Now that I am aware, my ruling goes like this. I was asked a number of years ago when I wrote about the topic, around 7 years ago in the summer, I wrote a series of articles. So a few websites asked me if I could write up guidelines of what they should publicize and not publicize on their site about this issue. So I said, I'm not a posek, I'm not a Rav, and I don't want to be the one that paskins what they should and shouldn't do, but I would like to write up for them the guidelines, what the questions should be asked to the rabbi. So if, for example, if you see this issue as being, as I said, God forbid you see it as a minimal issue, is one thing. But if you indeed see, and which is the fact, that any type of violation, sexual violation of a child, for that matter, anyone, by a person who's in a position of authority, and even someone who may be an equal, if it's a violation, you're dealing with an impact that you can equate with a reidif. You know what a reidif is? A reidif is someone who's running around the street with a knife in their hand. So there, suddenly all the laws of mesira, for example, informing on that person, calling the police, or lashon hara, speaking badly, all fall away. Because you're dealing with a person with a knife, someone running with a knife. You're now going to call a Rav and say, can I tell people that he's running around with a knife because it's lashon hara? Or can I call the police because I don't want to inform to the non-Jewish courts or non-Jewish authorities about this man? No, it's pekuach nefesh. The man is with a knife. He can kill anybody any second, so you have to do whatever it takes. So if indeed sexual molestation is like a reidif, and I suggest that it definitely is, and you can ask mumchim, and on the contrary, go to experts and ask, what is the impact this has? The impact it has is what's equated with some call it soul murder. Some even say it's worse than murder, which happens only once. This is an ongoing, because you're going into the kishkis, into the inner, intimate place. Erva, gilei erva, which is the most intimate inner place. And we know the Torah's words when it talks about gilei arayis. And I'm not talking now the technical gilei arayis and trying to cut corners and be a novel b'reshus HaTorah that says, you know what, I don't find an exact prohibition. I'm talking now the pure psychological, emotional, and physical violation of another human being, period. And what an effect it has on that person, and how they will look at sexuality as they develop as adults, into adults, and what marriage and what kind of effects it has. And you find out that there are marriages that have been destroyed as a result. That predators, that victims have become themselves pedophiles and predators. Then you start realizing this is maybe a gedder of a reidif. And once it's a reidif, there are different halachas applied. So yes, of course, you come to a Rav and give him one set of conditions and he gives you a ruling. You come to him and tell him it's a different set of conditions. A reidif, it's a whole different series of halachas. So the Rabbonim and authorities of our generation are responsible to find out what is the halacha here. Now I'm sorry, not what is the halacha, what is the mitzias? What is the existent reality? And then they can come and say, here is what we apply to that. The Rebbe said the same thing when it came to Eretz Yisrael. Who do you ask whether the Shtochim, the lands that were won over the 6-day war, Yom Kippur War, who do you ask whether returning them is good or not good? You don't ask a politician. You ask a doctor. You ask soldiers. You ask Anshe Tzava, Mumchim expert, military experts. People who know the military situation and are not jaded and clouded by diplomatic and political and financial concerns and image and PR. You ask, is this dangerous? When it says in Siman Shin Chavtes that there's an enemy on your border, who do you ask whether this is an enemy? You don't ask someone who's in a gay davar. You ask someone who can define what an enemy is. In medicine, it's a doctor. And in military situations, it's military experts. Same thing here. So that's number one. Once you establish that, then a whole new series. Now, what happened 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the fact that many rabbis or schools and others minimized it or chose to push it away or try to just get rid of the perpetrator, and I'm not here to defend them. Either they didn't know better, maybe they should have looked into it, but the fact of the matter, it wasn't just them. The entire world was not privy to this effect. If you really want to go back 50, 60 years, in the secular world, children were seen as deaf, dumb, and mute by some. That nothing affects them. That everything washes over them like it's nothing. Today we know otherwise. The Torah always knew otherwise. Now I want to add another thing, which of course was a big question that I posed, which is, why was this not addressed then by the Rabbeim in previous generations? Why don't you find many tshuvas about it? I mentioned one. Why don't you find a discussion if this was so destructive? So I, again, cannot defend or explain what was then. I definitely know that the people then were responsible people. We're talking about true leaders who cared about every iota of Jewish life, and definitely the sanctity of children, and taras and mishpacha, and the tara and the purity in the home and in the schools. And there's no question chinuch al taras hakedesh didn't just mean studying Torah, but also the environment and the type of teachers and the Yiras Shamayim. So there's no question that they would have done anything. If anything was defiled or violated, would be something that would be either unthinkable or addressed in the most aggressive possible way. And yet you don't find. And as Rabbanim have asked me this question, many say, how could I come out so strongly when we don't find our precedent? So, giving it some thought, and I say this this is my humble opinion, because I have not found it in the Rebbe's direct sichos or letters, something I wish I could have asked the Rebbe about if I had the opportunity. I have not found. If someone has something that is not, that I'm not aware of, others are not aware of, I think it's incumbent to share it because this is a very vital component. But I will apply the same idea because I have found similar ideas. So you could either say one of two ways, that either in previous generations it didn't exist in the way it exists today, that if it did, it was an anomaly, it was an exception, and definitely not as an epidemic. And that's one way you can explain. Or you can say that there's some things that even Torah people were not aware of the impact of it. Why? How could you say something like that? So I found the Sikha. There's a famous Sikha in Yud Beis Tammuz, Tov Shin Yud Beis. It's actually printed in Likutei Sichos, volume 1, page 150. And the Rebbe addresses the issue, so there was those that opposed the learning of Chassidus for two reasons. If it's an important learning, why was it not learned earlier? Until the Baal Shem Tov, there's no such thing as limud teres Chassidus. Definitely not to the Alter Rebbe. So they say, it's not necessary, it's optional at best. Second time they have, that this type of limud learning Chassidus brings to bittul. Mavatal zay metzias ha-geshem va-yesh. Because, Yisod in Chassidus is the bittul ha-metzias of geshem and yesh. The sublimation and the nullification of the ego, of the arrogance, or even more than that, of teaching how the whole world is nullified in the presence, kula kamei kula chashiv, in the presence of the divine. Bittul is v'chaninyan for shlila v'heder. That's the second time. And bittul, eliminating something, bittul is a negative thing. So why get involved in something? Torah is a positive thing. The Rebbe then goes on and begins to discuss things. The Rambam says that in illnesses there are two types. There's spiritual illnesses and physical illness. And the Rebbe addresses the illness, one of the illnesses of our time that didn't really exist in previous generations. We call it Yena Machla. And I don't want to use another name. That's the way the Rebbe even says it. It's so horrible that we don't give it by name. Well, how is this Machla different than all others? The Rebbe explains, usually an illness is something that's lacking in the person's health. And here is an extra growth. the cells begin to multiply in a cancerous fashion, and as a result can cause problems. And the solution here, different than all healing, you heal the person. Here you have to attack the extra growth, you have to attack the element itself, and in the process even sometimes kill good cells in order to get rid of the bad cells. And the Rebbe speaks that even though this illness did not exist before, or we weren't aware of it, because some people argue that this illness wasn't aware of because people, Rahman al-Islam, became ill and died from other illnesses before this illness became aware. We became aware of it. So this illness is a result of the longevity and the success of medicine. So an illness suddenly was discovered that may have been there earlier, but usually would never have taken hold because other problems existed. The Rebbe hints somewhat like that to the point. So someone's going to argue because we didn't take earlier refuah, I'm not going to do, so God forbid this illness comes, I'm not going to do anything because before they didn't. That would be the equivalent of someone saying we didn't have challenges before. They didn't know Chassidus before because they didn't have challenges, the same challenges. And the Rebbe then applies this to the lesson of Chassidus. And this is what I want to bring it back to our discussion here. The Rebbe says that because of Ikfus in the Mashiach, we're at the end of days, so there are problems today that never existed before. And one of them is, he calls it clearly, the clip of Amolik Chutzpah and Yeshus. Ona tam and ona farvos. Irrational chutzpah and yeshus. Let's translate chutzpah and yeshus. Chutzpah, we all know what chutzpah is. And yeshus is a certain arrogance. Now the Rebbe says, Amol is given gaiva and yeshus. There was also once upon a time arrogance and arrogance. And so aber nit given as vergrebt behind. It wasn't so grob. So the Rebbe says, from this is a rizikum in gashmis. Everything in the physical comes from the spiritual. The illness that we were talking about, Yena Machla, is a result of the Ruchnisdika Gaiva and Yeshus that exist today. Let me just qualify. The Rebbe is not saying that someone who has Gaiva and Yeshus is going to get this illness or that the illness is a result. He's just saying the concept that exists of such an illness that we have today is this Yena Machla has no reason, suddenly, without any warning. The Metzias nimmt zu the Keiches von Guf, als wie der Iker Metzias wohl gewähren nur sie. And it's completely focused on selfishness. Cancer is about cells beginning to just consume everything around it and the health of the human being. Different than every possible illness. And the Rebbe equates it with the spiritual illness of arrogance. So the Eberste Magdalene gewähnt to the full Makkah. And the Eberste preceded the illness, the cure to the illness, and gave us Chassidus that has an ability to disturb the yeshus that exists in this time and weaken it and nullify it. So that's the answer to the two people, to the two arguments. Why we do it, why, even though it wasn't existent in the previous generations, we didn't have such a problem in the previous generation. And number two, that though it's bittul, yes, because today you need the extra bittul due to the extra yeshus that exists in the world. The Rebbe then qualifies and says the difference is the moshel and nimshel are not comparable. The example and the moral are not exact. Why? Because when it comes to the illness, this healing has to be very limited, only to the amount necessary to heal, whether it's radiation or chemo. He doesn't mention it, but he alludes to it. And when it comes to Chassidus, however, you can learn more Chassidus and more Chassidus and more Chassidus. There's no limit to that. That's the point, and you can look it up yourselves. Why am I mentioning this? Because reading this suggests that there are problems today that didn't exist. So it's very possible that either it didn't exist or people were not aware of the impact, even Torah people. Well, Raya Chassidus did not exist. Limud Chassidus, as we know it today, before the Baal Shem Tov, before the Alter Rebbe. Are we going to say the generation before were lacking something? We don't say that. They were not. It wasn't needed. Or what was needed wasn't done by the few Yechidei Gula that learned Pnimis HaTorah. Then the result came, mitzvah legalizes HaChochmah. So the increased darkness necessitated increased Magdim Refuah L'Makkah. The same you could say, the issues that we're dealing today with the violation, especially of children, the epidemic part of it perhaps didn't exist. Even if it did, it may not have existed like it is, the Grobkeit like it is today. I'm suggesting that. And therefore, that's why we don't find much written about it. But today we do have the issue. So say that because it wasn't written about then would be the equivalent of saying Since they didn't learn Chassidus, then they didn't have the Yeshus, then they didn't have the Stiyana Machla, then we can't bring any reforms. We can't do something that was not done then. But today we do have the issue. So regardless of how you interpret what was the past, today we have the issue. And doctors and professionals, Alpitera, will tell you the impact of it. And therefore we cannot just dismiss and say that since in the past they didn't deal with it, we have to follow that guideline as well. As the Rebbe says many times about Neshek and other things. Yes, our grandparents also didn't read newspapers. And our grandparents didn't do other things. The Rebbe speaks about it also of the education of women, the Armumias. Yes, it didn't exist. Today, we're exposed to all kinds of things in life. To say then, we can't add anything in Torah and Yiddishkeit. So regarding our issue, yes, this is a klala, a curse of our times, and we will be judged for how we deal with protecting the most purest and the most important part of our community, and that's our children, our defenseless, vulnerable children. So I wanted to elaborate on this because I think it's critical to set the record straight regarding this issue. Someone has a different way of looking at it, but I'm trying to quote some of these sources. As I said, I think the psyche here about the Yeshus and Klippa, which Yesheminim, you could even say that also is part of what predators do. Complete selfishness. For somebody to go and violate a child, we're not talking about two consenting adults, which also is I don't want to suggest in any way that that's permissible or allowed. But here, to go to a child in things that are horrendous, obscene fashion, that, everybody has their taivas. Everybody can imagine, I may do something, I won't act on it. But this is something for an adult to in some way violate a child, is complete yeshus. It's not like the child is reciprocating. It's not like it's in two directions. It's complete violation. It's a one-way street. So you talk about an arrogance and a yeshus, like you said, it's hard for us to even, someone who doesn't have this illness or whatever you want to call it, it's hard for even to fathom, to wrap our heads around it. But you see it. And I don't want to speak about the most horrendous scenarios, but they are definitely in the context of a total narcissism. Total narcissism. So you could say this illness that the Rebbe is saying in our times spills itself out. It doesn't speak specifically. I qualify and say, I'm saying this is my leap. But based on that, as such, then comes down to dealing. If indeed it has this type of impact, and it's one of the issues we must deal with, sadly, then we have to deal with it full force. It's called zero tolerance. Zero tolerance. So firstly, let's deal with the sensitivity to the people who unfortunately have been hurt in such a way. To in any way dismiss it, in any way to minimize it, any way to not believe, and say, no, it can't be, adds not just salt to the wounds, it could be even worse. The silence could be worse than the rape. Because then you're invalidating the person's right to even cry out. It's one thing being perpetrated, but one thing being violated. Another is, I can't even cry. I can't even say it's a problem. So that becomes hastir astir. What does that mean? That even the darkness doesn't know it's dark. So our role as responsible adults, whether it's parents, whether it's older siblings, whether it's schools, is to aware that it does exist, whether we like it or not, and we have to do everything possible to protect, but also to validate, and someone comes, do not dismiss it because it's uncomfortable, because it's going to give a bad name to the family. You have to nip it in the bud and do whatever it takes in a discreet way, in a confidential way, but nevertheless in that. And for the children themselves or anyone who's been there, they have to feel that they're not going to be criticized and accused and be seen as the perpetrator themselves, which has been unfortunately a big part of history, where the victim suddenly becoming the perpetrator. Because why are you making a mess? Why are you rocking the boat? This has to become something known in every family, in every home, without any ifs or buts. Now, obviously, you could say maybe a child is exaggerating, maybe a child, something. Most people don't make up things like this. I don't think there's any documentation of made-up stories. If there is an exception here and there, maybe. But overall, we err on the side of caution, not on the side of maybe it's not. Schools and camps and anywhere where children are there, your job is not just to educate them, but protect. There should be marshals in every public place like that with very strict rules. I mean discreet marshals. No one has to know what they do. But you could see they're there after hours. No teacher should be with a student left alone, no matter what. There's none of that stuff. And if somebody sees something, this marshal sees something that's unacceptable, immediate, without even question, has to warn, one warning, and you're out. Zero tolerance. Because remember, this crime thrives in silence. It thrives when nobody's saying anything. There's no light shining. Because perpetrators are not strong people. They're not like aggressive violators. They thrive in, they're weak people who thrive on vulnerable and shy and weak individuals. So shining a light in the sense of creating the burglar alarm, metaphorically speaking, is one of the critical ways. Zero tolerance. That alone can lower the impact. So the sensitivity to the individual I've addressed. The address of how we should be vigilant, absolutely. Parents, you have to keep your eyes open. Any shift in children's behavior, and I don't mean just a small little minor shift, suddenly you see a change pattern, doesn't happen in a vacuum. Something happened. I'm not always saying it's sexual. It could be other things. People can be bullied. They can be intimidated. There's other things, other forms of abuse. But don't ignore it. Because you're dealing with an innocent child. You're dealing with an impressionable, warm piece of wax where every experience is etched. And we have to educate all of us to realize that you're dealing with children here. And you're dealing with impact that can change the course of a person's history. You're not playing games here. I think if there's that type of awareness, and not in a frightening way, not in a threatening way, not in a positive way, all this can serve as preventive medicine. So I'm mixing it a preventive, but at the same time dealing with the actual issues, as I said, the sensitivity, and addressing it, and not pushing it away. And with this cooperation on this level, by people, there's no question we can do much impact. Now, of course, the big problem is someone will say, you know what? Who knows how high this goes? There are perpetrators everywhere. There are people invested that it shouldn't be exposed, it shouldn't be talked about. Not for good reasons, because they may be found guilty. Well, you know something, that cannot be a motivation for us to capitulate ourselves. On the contrary, that's the only reason we should be even more vigilant. Okay. Now let's talk about the other side of things. Can we embarrass abusers? How do you deal with it? Well, here there are experts that say that this is one of the most notoriously underreported crimes because perpetrators, violators, are not rehabilitatable. Many, many experts say that. It's hard for me to accept that because we believe in Judaism, especially at Chassidus, everything can be rehabilitated. But I do understand the reason for it is because many of the people who do this do not, notoriously, are known to not acknowledge it. Like you have, for example, gambling addictions, you have other sex addictions, you have drug addiction, alcohol addiction. There are many addictions. And there are out there, there's AA, there are many groups, there are many individuals who have rehabbed, who have cleaned up their act. When it comes to this, it seems to be, and again, this is what my information knowledge is, that this is one of the least acknowledged. People will not admit it. They will always find excuses. They'll admit it, maybe it may be a threat with real blackmail or something like that. And if some person doesn't really admit to a crime, you can imagine, and even if they do and you're forced to, you don't have a person who's ready to rehabilitate because they're not ready even to acknowledge. Or maybe even they acknowledge, they don't understand the gravity of what's going on. Which is why there is in the United States today this whole thing that you have to report sex violators, that if they get out of prison or something, everyone in their neighborhood and communities must know about it. Because they say that people are repeat violators. I'm not going to get into that area right now because I do not consider myself an expert to say that's the case. But that is what experts are saying, and we cannot ignore that. With that said, so what do we do with perpetrators? Let's read a question or two here. I suspect abuse in my home. What do I do? And I heard this not in writing, but the woman told me that I think my husband is an abuser in our own home. Should I leave him? Should I threaten him? Well, let me tell you this. If he was running around with a knife and stabbing your children, would you ask me the same question? You would not. Yes, you have to put your foot down, absolutely, because a big part of, especially in homes, is that the spouse becomes a inadvertent accomplice. And I can tell you from my experience, thank God not personal experience, but in dealing with it, that many people will accuse their mothers more than their fathers, even though the father was the abuser, because you should have protected me. He was a sicko. You should have protected me. So I say right now to anyone listening to this, if there is any such suspicion, If there's even a suffix vexvek, you must act on it. Because it's not going to go away. It's not like, oh, it's over with because you ignored it. These things don't go away. How do you act on it? In a discreet way. It's probably difficult to confront a spouse. You may need to bring someone else in a professional way and get advice what to do. There are things that can be done. Don't do it on your own. Get advice first. Same thing with children or siblings, older siblings. We must not tolerate this. This cannot be acceptable. It's causing too much damage. It's too destructive. If it was something less, people have, every family has its quirks and so on. So, we tolerate certain things, but not things that are destructive of any form of abuse. I'm talking about this particular one, but the truth is any type of abuse. Now, how to deal with it has to be done in a healthy way. You don't want to become an unhealthy responder to an unhealthy situation. So that's what needs to be addressed. Okay, so now, regarding embarrassing abusers. So last week I read the painful question about this young man who Nebuch killed himself after he was exposed, and I heard that was not given an aliyah in a shul. And he went and a lot of his own sexual deviations were exposed and were in public. And some argue we should not have exposed him. We should not have exposed him because look what happened. Well, let's first talk about the whole thing with exposing and not exposing. It's a complicated one, and I'm not from the lynch mob advocates. I don't believe in lynch mobs. When I started writing about this topic several years ago, I received calls from a few psychiatrists who I know, who themselves were hurt as children in yeshiva and so on, and they wanted me to join their group where they want to go after every possible perpetrator. Yes, revenge is part of it, but also to once and for all clean things up. I told them, since I was not myself violated, I don't feel comfortable to be part of this group. And also, I don't believe that going into a lynch mob is the way to go. But at the same time, to say that there's no value to it all, you're dealing with a very, very sick element here. And if you're not going to have some people who are really ready to do whatever it takes, you may not be able to eradicate it. So it's a complicated one. And it's not easy to make a decision. Some things, you talk about purely Torah and Halacha. We have to go with Torah and Halacha, which means if something like this happens, think of it like a reidif. Yeah, you have to do whatever it takes. You don't say we cover it up or it's bashful and embarrassing. The fact is, if somebody is a perpetrator and somebody does not have remorse and has not dealt with it, and someone will claim, unless I publicize this person, others are in danger, there's a strong argument to say, I'm not going to tell you to publicize it, but how could I tell you not to do so? So I'm not going to get up here and say a black and white ruling on this, but the bottom line is, because this is such a horrendous crime, to suddenly say that exposing it is worse than the crime, that's ridiculous. I had someone call me and say my husband was put up on one of these wall of shames, and say, what can I do? It's destroying our family. So, I had much compassion for the woman. It was clear to me that she was not responsible. Maybe as a silent accomplice, I can't say about that. So I said, did he do it or did he not? She said, I don't believe so. So I said, so sue them. So sue the wall of shame or sue that entity and for defamation and so on. That's what I would do if somebody put my picture up in a place where it's completely, no, we can't really do that. Well, because there was probably some evidence. So this is a horrible situation. What do you tell somebody? What do you tell a family? More importantly, what did the perpetrator do? Didn't just violate the victim. Violated his own family. He's now destroyed his family. What was he hoping, that it should be covered up? That's his hope. And who should be the onus today? Should it be that people who've been hurt and molested, they should be afraid to expose because they can't have shidduchim? Or the one that perpetrated should be afraid? Maybe that'll be a deterrent. So we're dealing with a complicated situation. Why is it complicated? Because those that have already, Rahman al-Islam, violated others, they're in that situation. What do you do as a deterrent for anyone that may potentially do it tomorrow? Maybe fear is a deterrent. Maybe exposure is a deterrent. Maybe if they know that their families will be hurt, that's a deterrent. Not that I want to hurt anyone. Not that I think we should hurt anybody. But great damage has been done. So I'm addressing it very bluntly because I'm putting it all on the table because I'm a believer that this has to be addressed in a healthy way. Not with vengeance, not with emotions, but in a sober way, a Torah-dika way. If it does cause such damage, we have to address it. We have to be open about it and show zero tolerance for anything of this nature. And I have no doubt that if we do that, we will lower lower the violations, and healing predators is something I'd like to address at a different time. What you deal with that, because it's its own topic, it deserves its own discussion. Here I'm trying to discuss about the circumstances and the environment in which we live. Now, sadly, we live in a time, as the Rebbe said, that there's a new yeshus and Chutzpah that exists today that never existed before. And it spills itself out that when there's unhealthy elements in a family, especially when the rabbi or the father or the mother have reputations, their reputation is more important than their behavior. And there's all kinds of secret lives of people doing things and living two lives. On the outside they have this whole reputation, on the side they are doing things that are really inappropriate. And of course the place where it plays itself out most when you have a dysfunctional generation is in the area of intimacy and sexuality. That's the place where it plays itself out. So perhaps this is, in a way, the final frontier. That even though we're at the threshold, as the Rebbe said, not effen de eigen, but effen de eigen means also seeing yizbaru v'yislabna hadvarim, as the Rebbe explains, that even though you may see things, 'cause it's not a contradiction to what the Rebbe said in Tofshin Yud Beis. It's not a contradiction, because the fact is, when you open your eyes and you get clarity, the slime and the grime comes oozing out of the pores when you open them up. You go into a schwitz and the pores open up. So this is maybe the final frontier, the protection of our children, which leads me to think, and again, this is a yesh emrim, a yesh lemer, and I've always tried to stick to the sources, but nevertheless, there are some places where you get an instinct, and I want to share that instinct, and that is that when the Rebbe established Tzivus Hashem in Tofshin Mem Aleph, it was actually when I began to write Fabrengen, so I was very familiar with the whole process then. I think now in retrospect, everything the Rebbe established is far deeper and more than we can ever imagine. The 10 Mivtzoyim, the Yud Beis Psukim. The Rebbe, as a visionary, saw the whole generation, saw the future, understood and took the pulse of our generation. But he dealt with things in his way. That perhaps the establishment of Tzivus Hashem was the Rebbe's way of going to war and battle by giving children an additional asset beyond their homes and their schools, an additional reinforcement, first of all, of their value and their dignity as children, and in a seitev way, bringing so much aid into them to give them strength to deal with the challenges that exist out there. And Tzivus Hashem, of course, was not just for the children, it was for the people who run Tzivus Hashem, and the people, the adults and the parents who enlist their children to also become far more vigilant in protecting what the Rebbe would call hevel, so often from the Gemara, hevel shein beichet, the breath that has no sin, the innocence. Al tige b'mishiche. The last Simchas Torah Fabrengen. Pretty rare that the Rebbe would do this. You look at Simchas Torah Tofshin Nun Beis. Focuses the children there. Al tige b'mishiche, the Rebbe used. Do not touch Mashiach. Who's Mashiach? My Mashiach, my anointed ones, my children. He talks there that everyone is supposed to participate in building the Beis HaMikdash except Tanekah Shel Beis Rabban. Why? Because their learning is greater than the Beis HaMikdash. And the Rebbe asked the children to say L'chaim, that's Simchas Torah Nun Beis. It's not the only time Simchas Torah the Rebbe did that, but there's an extraordinary focus on children and Simchas Torah connection to children. Al Tigu Mashiach is an interesting statement. It's a Gemara, it's a Posuk. But it also refers very much to our subject. Do not touch the children. Touch can mean physical, it can mean emotional, it can mean psychological, it can mean inappropriate. Protect the children. And perhaps Tzivus Hashem was established due to the Rebbe's knowledge in his own way, and he wanted to deal with it not by focusing, like Chassidus does not focus on the negative in this regard, even though at times you have to deal with a crime as a crime, but more importantly, to teach us the importance of the children and to turn us into clarions, that we should come out in a positive way and say, we're dealing with our holy little children, Kadesh. Sikh of the Rebbe says, why do you begin Parsha learning with children Vayikra? Yove Teherim, Yilimdu Teherim, that the pure should come and learn the pure, to emphasize how important these children are for our welfare, for the future, and so on. Which anyone with a little seichel in their head means, obviously, protecting them for anything from the negative. But the Rebbe, in his way, did it in the positive, which was so often the approach from Chassidus and especially from the Rebbe. So that's my thought on the Tzivus Hashem issue. Now, I addressed different aspects of this, and there's more that I wanted to say, but I want to just cover at least one or two other topics. And we'll continue this discussion in the future episodes, and I definitely welcome comments, feedback, and so on to this important, critical issue, because as one thinker once wrote, it's infinitely easier to bring up a healthy child than to fix a broken adult. So 1 hour with a child, preventive medicine, 1 hour of dealing with something positively or avoiding something negative can yield decades of preventing and having to go fix a broken adult who already has been in some way impacted. So it's a good segue, the topic of educating our children. Where's the Mentchlichkeit? So the question is the following: how should we address Chutzpah and instill Mentchlichkeit in our children? It's interesting, I wasn't planning to do it this way, but it's very much connected to what we just spoke about, Chutzpah and children. Are the schools responsible for teaching manners and values of respect, or does that come from the home? So again, I'm clarifying, I'm starting a new topic, which has some connection, obviously. Thank you so much, Rabbi Jacobson, for the insightful weekly videos. You inspire me so much. Next question. Why does our chinuch system often, not always, there's some great schools around, not focus enough on the basic Mentchlichkeit? I worked in a Chabad Mesid after working in a Jewish non-Chabad school, and the differences are enormous. Those non-frum kids had such outstanding values of respect, non-judgmentalism, and highly developed social as well as emotional skills. Coming to a Chabad Mesid is almost the diametric opposite. Well, okay. Someone writes, I will add my theory to this phenomenon. All those non-frum kids were in their 30s, 40s, maximum 2 kids per family, and were given much personal attention at home. In contrast, these 8 to 12 kids' homes, from which I come from as well, the parents don't provide that. Okay, it's not their fault, they can't because they have 5 kids under 5 and a baby. So they ignore what their other kids then, as long as they're doing what the Rebbe said, have as many kids as possible. The result, as I said, are obvious. It is almost like a lifelong gamble. Give birth to as many children as possible, children factory, and hope they will figure out their life eventually, as I had to as well. Okay, well, I couldn't disagree more than with this last statement. I read it simply because just to give someone their voice. But I don't know what family you grew up in, and I'm sure unhealthy families are unhealthy families, even if they have one child or no children. I know people that are extremely unhealthy, and children have nothing to do with it. So to blame it on having children is ridiculous. If you're an unhealthy person, you're going to create an unhealthy environment and have a dysfunctional home. If you're a healthy person, you can have 100 children and they'll all be healthy. So let me just make that very clear. So start blaming on these things. On the contrary, when the Rebbe came out about having many children, it was very clear. It was about a bracha. Children are a bracha. If you don't know how to handle it, so figure out how to handle it. But to suddenly turn something that's a blessing into a curse is ridiculous. Go to anyone that's having difficulty with children, infertility issues, and so on, and you tell me what they'll say to you. So I adamantly want to disagree with this writer, even though I read it. As far as the whole issue with Mentchlichkeit, absolutely unacceptable. Yes, the whole point of Torah and Chassidus is to mevi shalom le'elam. Kol ha'Torah kulu le'nitna l'lasa shalom be'elam. Derech eretz kadmon l'Torah. I don't think I need to use this platform to quote every Maimer Chazal about Derech eretz. We all know that Rebbe's approach to his mother, to every human being, the Mentchlichkeit, even to people that were, so to speak, benagdim to the Rebbe. So I don't even know where there's a yesod for any type of Mentchlichkeit. And to start finding excuses that it's Chassidishkeit not to be Menchlich, or to have Chutzpah is ridiculous. It's pure Hefkedus and has nothing to do with the Rebbe, nothing to do with Chassidus. Let's make it loud and clear. It's not a Chabad thing. It's about individuals. I know some Chabadniks that are the most refined and Derech Eretz people, and I know many people are not. This is about, yes, what we instill in our children. And it is a problem. It is a problem. I went to school. I remember the lack of Mentchlichkeit and Chutzpah that I had, others had, and I'm embarrassed about it today. Why it was tolerated, I don't really know. Why it was acceptable, and I don't think there's any way to justify it. Now, how to deal with it starts from the womb. It starts from the beginning, like everything. In a home that criticizes everybody, and their children grow up hearing critique from parents, what do you think they're going to do? They'll also criticize everybody. In a home where there's no derech eretz for rabbonim, or no derech eretz for authorities, and everybody's laughed at, what kind of children do you think you're going to yield? Children that will do the same thing. So as parents, we've got to be very careful what we say. Even what we don't say, but definitely what we say in public and how we run our homes. There should be not even, in a home shouldn't be one negative word about another Jew. You have something to say, would your children have to hear it? Even if you have something to say, your spouse doesn't have to hear it either. But just for in case you have to vent, so go outside on a good windy day and yell to the skies about the people that you have grievances to. Even that, maybe then you can release it. The point I'm trying to make is that we have to protect our children, to protect ourselves. And it all begins, people don't just become not menschlich, they pick it up from somewhere. Now, if a child has particular chutzpah issues, it's a parent's responsibility, more than the school even, to do something about it. Now, how? At an early age, certain disciplines, certain incentives, you try to nip it. Why? Why is there this chutzpah? Now, definitely there's some children that are wilder than others. And again, all this has to be looked at. Is it something you could prevent? Is it something you have to now deal with after the fact? But make it very, very clear. To address it is again, zero tolerance. Now, obviously, you have to be careful and commensurate to a punishment and discipline for chutzpah is different than, God forbid, violations that we talked about before. But nevertheless, this is something that should be addressed. People who are b'divrei chacham benachas tishmaon, when they speak kindly, their children pick that up. When people are unkind to others, what do you think the children are going to do? And I'm talking about even things like how you say thank you to a taxi driver or to a waiter, or how you behave with strangers. It's not just people, guests, your patience level and impatience. This all begins from adults. It begins in our homes and our schools, and that's how it spills over. Okay, so more topics obviously to discuss. I just wanted to address that because this is a topic that I've been leaving and kept been pushing off. And of course, I'm happy to get more questions. I want to just conclude again with the beauty of our children. They are our future. Baneinu arevim ba'deinu, or baneinu arevim esanu, which is the lashon in the Medrash. They are the guarantors, the only ones that God chose as accept as guarantors for the Torah. It's the future. It's our most sacred commodity. There's nothing, I would say, in a society, to measure the health of a society, there's nothing stronger than seeing how have we dealt with our children. And that will define whether we failed or succeeded in our time. And there's no question that Rebbe connected children to Mashiach, Altigu b'Mashiach, and connected it directly in many ways with Tzivus Hashem. It's our job in this last stages of opening our eyes and recognizing the realities is not just to deny what's going on, but to flood the world, flood our lives with Kedusha and Eir and Kedusha, and Tara and holiness. Tara Mevil de Kedusha. Taras Mishpacha means more than just mikveh. It means a clean and holy home, an environment, a Beis Chabad, as the Rebbe would say. Bais Molis Forim, a house with a pushka, a house with a kosher home, with a siddur, with a chumash. But that's just the physical elements. That the home is saturated with Kedusha, not just what objects you have, but how you treat your children and how you protect your children. And definitely not Rahman al-Islam in any way defiling or violating. And should there be anything from the outside of the home that's violating, to deal with it decisively. Again, to protect, to nurture, not to terrify, but to help our children grow through it and listen to them in the proper fashion. Let me conclude with the MyLife Chassidus Applied essay contest. One more week until Thursday night, midnight, Adar, to submit your essay with the possibility of winning the first prize of $10,000, which we hope to announce at the end of Adar. And please don't hesitate, do your best. I am sure that if you put your head to it and your heart to it, you can produce unbelievable stuff. As I've mentioned a number of times, I think the winner is open to anybody. I do not think that there's anyone out there that has an edge on anyone else. I really truly believe that it's about looking at a maimer, at a vort, Chassidus, something from the seven Rabbeim, finding a heartfelt and powerful way, creative way of applying it to something, to every challenge that you'd like to address. So everyone should have atzlacha with that, and we look forward to receiving your submissions. The guidelines again at meaningfullife.com/MyLife/contest. This has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 56. Every week, 8 to 9 p.m., Sunday evenings. So until next week, episode 57, everyone should have a very hatzlachadik week, a chassidish week, For those in the cold regions, a week where the Rebbe said to President Shazar, a week where we warm up, we make from the frost, then is frost. Thank you very much.